Quick demo of this tutorial. Here we will build a beautiful quiz application with React.js and ASP.NET Core Web API with latest Material UI 5. This project is built from scratch so that you could learn all about full stack web development with React.js and ASP.NET Core Web API. Apart from creating a beautiful Material UI interface, you could learn best practices in using Context API, form design, routing, authentication in small applications like this, etc. So please watch till the end of this tutorial and build your own quiz application. So first of all, let's start with creating React app inside this project folder here. For that, we have to open command prompt from this folder directory. So you can use this shortcut inside this folder path here. Just type cmd, then hit enter. So here we have opened the command prompt from the same directory as that of this folder here. Now to create the React app, you can execute this command npx create React app, then name the application in small letters. Now before creating React or .NET Core Web API, make sure that inside the folder path directory here, we don't have any special characters. It might cause problems while running the application. I had some similar experience in past, so make sure to avoid special characters inside the folder path directory here. Now let's execute this create React app command. It might take a while, so please be patient. Finally, we have completed with the app creation command. As a result of that, here we have a folder with the same name as that of the React application. Now we have to get into this new folder, quiz client. Now let's open the folder within VS Code. For that, you can execute this code space then period or dot simple. Hit enter. So here we have the brand new React application with default components. Now let's run this application. For that, open the terminal. You can use this menu item here, or you can use the shortcut Ctrl Shift then backtick. Then execute this command npm start. It will compile and open this application in our default web browser. So this is how the fresh React app looks like. For designing this application, I'll be using Material UI components. I have already created a Material UI tutorial on this channel. It was created with previous version of Material UI. Soon I will be uploading a new version of the same. The existing tutorial link is given in video description and inside the iCard top right corner. Now let's look how to integrate Material UI into our React application. For that, click on this Get Started button here. First of all, we have to install these libraries here. So let's copy this command. Let's open a fresh terminal like this and paste it over here. So here we are installing the core package of Material UI. These are two packages introduced in the latest version, which is a styling engine in version 5. So here we have successfully installed the packages. This documentation is recommending this Roboto font. So let's grab corresponding reference and let's paste that inside the index.html here. Let's paste it just above this head end tag here. We also need material icons. So let's copy this reference also and let's paste it over here. Now this index.html file has the HTML wrapping for the entire application. Inside this HTML we have this div with the ID root. This div is replaced within this index.js here, which is the root JavaScript file for any React application. You see, the root div is replaced with the components passed here. By default, app component is shown inside the root div. And here we have the app component. And whatever we have here is responsible for the default view of the application here. So first of all, let me remove these default HTML from here and this logo reference also. Now let's quickly design a login form for this application. First of all, I will create a new folder here called components, so that I will create this component login. To create the component, I will be using this snippet RFC React functional component. In order to use this snippet, first of all, you have to install this extension, this one here. Okay, now click on this. So here we have the corresponding component with the same name as that of this JavaScript file here, login. Now let's show this component inside this app component here. Now while tapping the component, you will see the suggestions, and if you click on that, corresponding import statement will be added at the top like this. Sometimes it may not work as you expected. In that case, you have to manually add the import statement up here. Okay, now let's design a form for the login operation with name and email address. For that, first of all, we'll be having an HTML form here. To disable default HTML validation, we can have this attribute. Now we need an input text box. For that, inside Material UI, you could see this component text field under components. We need a text box that looks like this. So we could do this text field. I don't know why my auto suggestion is not working for Material UI components. So I will add the import statement here. From Material UI material, we have to import text field. First of all, we have email. So label will be email, the name of the component. Now in order to look like this text box here, we have to set this variant property as outlined. So here we have the text box. Inside that you could see the auto suggestion or the previous autocomplete from previous posted data. If you want to ignore previous posted data like this, you could set this attribute autocomplete as off. Like this, we need one more text box for name. Now we need a submit button. For that we have a component button. You could see the same inside this menu here. Or you could also search inside this text box. For that you can use the shortcut Control K so that you can easily find the component that you are searching for. So let's search for button. Hit enter, you could easily see the corresponding component document like this. So here we have the button component. While typing the component here, you could see the auto suggestion. If you can't, like this, just use the shortcut, hold Control, then press space. Then you could see the possible auto suggestion. If you select the item, corresponding import statement specified here will be added at the top. So first of all, type is equal to submit. The variant will be contained. Size will be large. All of these properties and attributes are mentioned inside this documentation here. Inside the button, we will show this start. So this is how the login form looks like. Now let's fix everything in proper place. For that, first of all, we will wrap this form with this Material UI component box. It is similar to a div. Now in order to customize any Material UI component, you can use this property SX. For that, you can go to the corresponding API documentation for button. Here we have the corresponding link. So here we have the available properties for the component, and here you could see the SX. It will accept these types of data, and here this SX page tells how you can customize the component by passing an object like this. Okay, so here we go. SX. First of all, we want to pass an object. For that, first of all, we have to wrap everything with a pair of curly brackets like this. Since we have to pass an object, we need another pair of curly brackets like this. Now here we are going to customize these input text boxes here. Now if you inspect these text boxes, you could see that for any Material UI component, there will be a root CSS class like this. You can use the corresponding class for customizing this specific component. And the root CSS class for this text field component is MUI form control -root. To see the same, let's search for the corresponding API, text field API. Inside this documentation, at the end, you could see the root CSS class as MuiTextField-root. So in order to customize text field, you can make use of this class here. Now how this customization is done. For that, let me copy this CSS root class here. You could see the same root class applied to this root outermost div for this component text field here. The text field from MUI displayed with an HTML div, and the outermost div is having the root class specified inside this documentation here. Now in order to customize this text field, we'll be using the same class like this. So first of all, I'm pasting the class here. Now this class is applied to a child component text field when considered to this box component here. This is a child component for this box component here. So in order to specify that, we could do this. Now this and symbol represent this box component itself. Now when you specify a class with a space in between them, it means we are going to apply this CSS when this class comes as a child, right? This is same in CSS also. So this is how we do it. Whatever styles that we specify here will be applied to the children of this box having this class. So first of all, I want to specify a margin of the range 1. As per the SX abbreviation, you can shorten this like M, like this. Now you can see the margin is applied to these text field. Now in order to split these text field into multiple lines, I will add this width attribute here, 90%. See, both of them are displayed on separate lines. So this is how we are going to customize Material UI components from now onwards. Now we need a separate line for this submit button also. So I will add this SX attribute. We want to apply these styles to this component itself. So we can directly pass the style here. Width is equal to 90%. Now I want to show this component inside a Material UI component card. So let's search for card here. Here we have various samples showing how you can make use of this component. Now let's quickly add the element inside this application here. Now with what we have explained, now you can easily follow and understand the Material UI components that I'm going to use inside this application. If you have any doubt, you can go through this documentation here. Now let's quickly complete this design here. First of all, we need a card component. The content of the card will be displayed inside this component card content. So let's move this form into this card content. Now let's set the width to 400 pixel. Now before anything else, I want to center this card component here. For that, I'm going to create a new component called center.js. And here we have the snippet to create the component. Now in order to center anything, I'm going to make use of Material UI component grid. So here we have the component grid. It is similar to the Bootstrap 12 grid system. First of all, we have this component grid, which is the container. So we have to specify that with this attribute container. And inside that, we need same component grid marked as item. So this is the container for the grid, and this is similar to a column. And the width of this column is specified with this attribute sx. And I will set it as to 1 column space. Now in order to align anything inside this grid at center, we could do this direction is equal to column and then set align items and justify content as center. And finally we have to set the min height. So I will use this property sx min height. I will set it as 100 VH. Now we just need to wrap everything inside this login component with this center component here. Whatever we have wrapped with this center can be accessed with the props parameter here. And it will be inside this property props children. Let's check that here. Sorry, we have a typo inside the center component. I always make this mistake. Instead of this equals simple, we need a colon. Boom, that's it. Now finally we need an h3 header for this login form here. So I will add this typography component. We need an h3 header, so I will set this variant as h3 and we need some vertical margin. So I will do this margin on y-axis of the range 3. Inside that we will show this quiz app. Now here we have everything we need. We just need to align them properly. For that I will add this CSS style here, text align as sender. Now there is one thing that I am recently concerned about, which is dark themes. These light themes cause a lot of eye strains compared to dark themes. So I'm going to quickly switch into dark theme with Material UI. So you can search for the documentation here. We just need to customize the default theme. So open this root JavaScript file index.js. If you want to stick with the light theme, you can ignore the steps here. So first of all, we need a theme object. And here we will call the Material UI function create theme. Now we have to pass the object with our customization. We just need to change the mode to dark. So let me copy this object from here and let's paste that over here. Now we'll wrap this app component with this theme provider. Now here we just need to pass the theme that we have just created. Now finally, in order to work this, we need to add one more component, CSS baseline. Boom, that's it. This is more healthy for your eyes in long run. Now here we have done with the design. In a bit we are going to create .NET Core Web API to store these email and name here. Before that, I just want to validate the form here. Let me close all of the component except this login component. Now first of all, we want to manage the values of these text field inside the state of this component, right? For that, we normally does this. We will be creating state object like this, value, then set value, and then we'll be initializing it with use state function. Inside this, we will be passing an object with the initial values. Instead of this, I will be creating a separate folder called hooks. Inside that, I will be creating this hook component use for. We have done this same multiple times in previous tutorials. I will just paste that same here and let's explain it. So here we have a component. Inside this hook, we have two state objects, values and errors. Inside this values state object, we'll be saving the values from these text field here. And the corresponding text field errors will be saved inside this object. This errors object is initialized with the empty object, and this values object will be initialized with an object returned from this function. This function will be passed as a parameter to this hook. We can see that in a bit. And here we have the handle input change. We don't have to rewrite that in all of the components where we have a form. And finally, we'll be returning everything that is required for the component with the form. So let me get rid of this. Now we could do this. Now we can call the useForm hook here. Now this hook returns an object with these properties. Now we can destructure the same inside this component here. Now in order to initialize this state object values, we have to pass this function, getFreshModel object. So I'll create the function here, getFreshModel. This is just a function to return an object like this. So here we go, name and email address with the default values is passed. Now we just need to pass the same inside this hook here. Now we can assign values from this object to these text field here. Values.email. The name of the component and the property used inside this state object must be same. That's how this hook is created. You could see that inside this handle input change here. Okay, I hope you don't need an explanation for this handle input change event method here. Most of you know how to handle this input change for these text fields here. Now we can provide the onChange event function, which is already defined inside the hook handle input change. Okay, that's it. Now let me copy this and pasting for name. So here we have assigned value for this text field. If you want to verify whether it is working properly or not, I will add this submit event login. So here is the function login with the default parameter e. First of all, we have to prevent the default behavior of the form, which is reloading the form. So prevent default. Now let's print the state object values. Now here we have the dev console. Let's enter some random values and submit the form. Boom, that's it. So the values from these input text fields are saving into our state object values. Now finally, I want to implement validation inside these form controls. For that, I will be creating a separate function, validate. First of all, we'll be creating an object, empty object like this. Then we'll be saving the errors related to email with this property email. Now in order to validate email addresses, I'll be using this regular expression. Now we just need to call this test function. Into that we can pass the values from our state email. If email is in proper format, then it will return true, so we don't have any error message. Otherwise we will say email is not valid. Now like this, we have to have the name validation. So values.name is not equal to empty string. Then we don't have an error message, else we will show this field is required. Finally, we will set these validation error messages into this state object errors returned from this hook here. So set errors. Into that we can pass this temp object, and finally from this function we need to return a boolean value indicating whether this form as a whole is valid or not. For that, all of these error messages here should be empty string, right? For that, we can make use of this object method values. Inside that we can pass this temp object. So actually this function returns an array of values inside this object here. And on that return array, we want to call this array method every. And inside this, we want to check all of the values inside this object are empty string. So if all of them are empty string, this will return true, otherwise false. So that indicates whether this form as a whole is valid or not. So inside this submit event here, we can call the function validate. So this log statement works if the form as a whole is valid. And finally, if any of these text field is invalid, we want to show them inside these corresponding text field here. In order to do so, in Material UI, first of all, we have to set this property error as true, and the validation error message will be shown with this property helper text. Now we want to do this dynamically if this field is invalid. For conditionally applying those properties, first of all, we wrap everything with a pair of curly brackets like this, and then I will do the destructure syntax like this. Inside the state object errors, if the value of the property email is empty or not. If it is not empty, we want to return an object with corresponding properties like error set as true and then the helper text, which is errors.email. If there is a validation error inside this property email, this object will be returned from this statement and it will be destructured here, and thereby the properties inside this object can be a part of this outer component here. So this is how we dynamically apply properties in React components. Now let me copy this and pasting for name text field. Now let me save this and back to the application here. Let's check whether it is working or not. Let's try to submit the form here. Let's provide an invalid email, pass some random name. So validation is working for name. Now let's make this valid. Boom, it's working properly fine. Now it's time to create an ASP.NET Core Web API project to save these informations from these fields and to process other queries related to quiz application. For this project, I'm using Visual Studio 2022 and the latest .NET Core version 6. Now let's start with creating the .NET Core Web API project. I will select this template, ASP.NET Core Web API, name of the application, Quiz API. Select the location where you want to save this project. So I'm selecting this project folder where we have already created our React application. As I mentioned already, make sure to remove special characters from this folder path directory here. So select the folder. Now let's create the project. Here I'm selecting the latest .NET Core 6 version. I will uncheck this configuration for HTTPS since we are creating this application for development. Make sure to enable this Open API support. It is really helpful to test the API. Now let's create the project. So here we have the brand new ASP.NET Core Web API project. First of all, let's start with DB model and DB creation using Entity Framework. For that, first of all, we have to install corresponding NPM packages. So right click on this project here, then manage NuGet packages. Inside this browse tab, search for Entity Framework. Let's download this Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now from this version drop down here, select the same version as that of the framework here. So 6 or 2. So selected the same version here. Now let's install the package. Accept the license. Now along with the package, we need to install these two packages, SQL Server and Tools. Select the same version as that of the framework. Click on Install. Entity Framework Core Tools. So here we have done with the installation of these three Entity Framework Core packages. Now let's create model classes for the DB. So first of all, I'll be creating the folder models. So first of all, we have question model. First of all, we have this primary key, question ID. Now the column corresponding to this property will be the primary key for this table. So we have to mark this with this key attribute. Now we have to import the corresponding namespace. For that, you can use this shortcut, hold Control, then press period. Now select this namespace here, data annotations. Then we have the actual question in words. Then image name. The name of the image required for illustrating this question will be saved inside this API and will be shown along with the question. So the image name will be stored inside this column and the actual image will be stored inside the project directory here. Then we have the 4 options for this question. Finally, the answer for this question, which is the index of the option from these options here. Since image name is optional, I want to make this property as nullable. For that, we just need to add this question mark as a suffix to this data type string here. Now, if we leave these model string properties as it is, when it is converted to the actual DB, the SQL Server columns corresponding to these properties will be having the data type of n-vocab max, which is more than what we need. So in order to limit the data type, we will specify the required data type here. So first of all, we have this attribute colon, import the namespace here. Now with this type name, we can specify the data type as n-vocab 250. So this is of the type 50 and vocab 50. Sorry, I made a mistake. All of these options are of the type string. So let me correct that here. And all of them will take the type and vocab 50. Now like this, let's create one more model for the participant. First of all, we have participant ID, then email, name of the participant, score, time taken to complete the quiz. Let's mark this property as the primary key. Now let's specify the column type for the string properties. So let me copy this. Let's add the corresponding namespace. So that's all we need as model classes. Now let's create the DB context. Quiz DB context. Now we have to inherit this from the entity framework class DB context. Now let's use the corresponding namespace entity framework core. Now we have to specify the constructor for this class, and this constructor will have a parameter of the type DB context options of the type quiz DB context as options, and we want to pass the same parameter to the base constructor. Now we'll be creating the DB and the tables corresponding to these model classes using migration. In order to do so, inside this DB context class here, we have to have a reference to those particular model classes here. For that, I will be creating properties of the type DB set with those model classes. Now, in order to use this quiz DB context by the framework, we have to inject this DB context instance into the framework. For that, open this program.cs file. In previous version .NET 5, we have been doing this in a file called startup.cs, but in .NET 6, we'll do the dependency injection inside program.cs. Now, for the dependency injection, we'll be using this builder instance here, builder.services.add DB context of the type quizDB context. As an argument to this method, we'll be passing a lambda expression with these options, and here we have to provide the provider for this DB, meaning we are going to specify which database we are going to use for this application. It will be SQL Server, so we can call this method here use SQL Server. Now let's use the corresponding namespace. Now into this function, we have to pass the connection string. So first of all, let's save the connection string inside this app settings.json file here. So here we go, connection string, and inside this, I will save the connection string with this name dev connection. And now for the sake of explanation, let me paste the template for DB connection string here. So first of all, we have to provide the SQL Server instance name. In my case, it is local SQL Express. So here I'm using a SQL Express instance that is installed on my local machine. And here we have to provide the DB name, so quizDB. So there will be a DB created with this name quizDB. For this connection, we'll be using Windows authentication, so set this trusted connection as true. And finally, in order to execute multiple queries at a time, we have set this property multiple active result sets as true. Now before going further, first of all, check whether this instance is already started or not. For that, first of all, open your run window. For that, you can use the shortcut Windows logo key, then R. It will open up this run command here, and then just type services.msc. It will open a window containing all of the services installed on your system. So let's search for the SQL Server instance here. So here we have the SQL Server instance name SQL Express. So you have to use the same name inside this portion here. And make sure that this SQL Server service is already running inside your machine. If not, you can see a start option here. Now let me close these services here. So here we have a proper connection string. Save this back to this dependency injection here. Now in order to retrieve the connection string saved inside this JSON file here, we just need to do this builder configuration.get connection string. Here we just need to provide the connection name that we have used here. So it is dev connection. So here we have done with the dependency injection. Now let's build this project. After successful build, we are going for migration, which is the process of creating the actual physical DB with these model classes provided here. For that, first of all, select the project, then go to tools, then manage NuGet packages, then package manager console, and make sure the same project that we have here, quiz API, is selected from this dropdown. Now first of all, we have to execute this command add migration. I will name this migration as initial create. Hit enter. During this process, the actual SQL Server script will be created according to the model that we have inside this project, which is saved inside this new folder migrations. Now in order to execute the SQL script for creating the DB, we have to execute this command update database. You could actually see the SQL script inside this package manager console window itself. Now once it is done, let's check whether it is created or not. For that, I will open my management studio here. Now let's connect to the same server instance that we have specified in the connection string. So here we successfully made a connection to the SQL Server instance. Now let's expand this databases node here. Boom, that's it. So here we have the new DB with the name QuizDB. The name of this DB is already mentioned inside this connection string here. Now let's check whether those tables are created as per our model class. So here we have those two tables, participants and questions. Now make sure that these tables are created as per the model classes that we have provided here. The name of these tables, questions and participant is taken from this DB context property dbSet. Now I have prepared 10 questions for this quiz app. So let's execute the query here. For now I will paste the insertion query here. I have given this SQL script inside the GitHub repository. Let's execute this. So here we have installed those 10 questions. Let's check that inside this table here. So here we have the 10 questions that I have prepared. The actual question is here inside this column. If there is an image for this question, the corresponding image name will be saved inside this column here. Then 4 options, and inside this answer column here, the correct option index is saved inside this column. For option 1, the index will be 0, then 1, 2, 3 like that, like the array index. Now enough with the DB. Now let's add this image mouse.png inside this project directory here. For that, I'll be creating a new folder, images. Now here is the image. Let me move this to the new folder here. Now it's time to create API controllers for these model classes. For that, first of all, let's build this project. After successful build, right click on controllers, then add controller. From this left panel, select API, then API controller with actions using entity framework. Model class will be question. Context is question DB context. Question controller. So here we have successfully created the API controller. Because of scaffolding mechanism, required web methods are already added to this controller here. Now there is a common error while creating controllers with this scaffolding mechanism, which is related to installing code generation design package. So let's check that here. Right click on the project, then go to manage and NuGet packages. And let's search for the package here, code generation design. So here is the package. It is already installed in this project. If you have an error message related to code generation package, if the package is not installed here, install the package with the same version as that of the ASP.NET Core. If it is installed and you have the same problem, then uninstall the package and install it again. Okay, so in most of the case that will solve the problem. Now back to this controller here. Now let's create one more controller for this model participant. Participant controller. Now that's also done. Now let's focus on this controller here. For any created controller, inside the controller constructor, you could see a parameter of the type QuizDB context. Now from where the value for this context parameter is passed. That's where dependency injection comes. So whenever there is a constructor parameter of the type QuizDB context, the instance for that will be passed from this dependency injection here. So that's how dependency injection works. An instance of this controller is created whenever we make a request to these web methods here. Then the framework automatically create an instance of this controller. Since we have a constructor parameter of the type QuizDB context, the dependency injection will provide the DB context. And it is saved to this private parameter underscore context. And inside these web methods here, the underscore context is used to feed or query the database that we have created. At this moment, we want to feed the participant email and name to this web API here. For now, let me collapse these web methods here. And for saving the participant details, I will be using this post web method here. So this existing post web API method will insert new participants. But we want some customization here. We will insert the corresponding participant details to the corresponding table. But if the combination of name and email is already existing, we won't insert it. Instead of creating a new participant, we will be returning the existing participant details back to the client side. So first of all, I'll be creating a temporary object here. Now let's check whether we have a participant with given name and email address. Participant, and we can call this var method, and here we have the lambda expression x such that x.name is equal to participant name, and let's compare the email also. And finally, we have to call this method post or default. If there is no such participant, we will do the insert operation like this here. Else, we will assign the temporary participant to this participant variable. And finally, from this method, we will return the object participant. Okay, now let's run this application. Now by default, the ASP.NET Core Web API will open an interface to interact with the API that we have created. All of the web methods are here. You can test them with these interface here. We'll be testing some of the web API methods here. Now from this login form here, we have to submit the email and name. So back to the VS Code here. Here we have the login form submit event. Now, in order to make an API request from this React application to the web API method here, we need to install the package Axios. So let's do that here. I'll open new terminal and let's do this npm install Axios. Now, in order to handle API requests, I'm going to create a separate folder API. Inside that, we will create this index.js. First of all, let's import the Axios package here. Now let's create and export this constant base URL. Inside that, I will save this base address here. So let me copy this. Okay, that's it. Now I will paste this function here. I have been using this pattern in almost all of my React tutorials before. We have a function create API endpoint, and which is exported from this index.js. For this function, we have an endpoint. And here we have generated the complete URL, and from this function we have returned an object with functions required for all of the operations. To retrieve all of the records, we have this fetch function. To retrieve a specific record with a given ID, we have this function here. In both of these cases, we are making a get request with the corresponding URL. And with this function, we are inserting a new record, and here we have the put method to update an existing record, and this delete function delete an existing record. So these methods get, post, put, delete methods are from Axios, and they will make a get request these corresponding web API methods of the type put, post, get, etc. You will understand this better as we go forward. So inside this form submit event, we have to make a post request to this controller web API method here. For that, we could do this. First of all, we will call the method that we have just created. Into this function, we have to pass the endpoint for the URL. So the base URL is already created, base URL with the API, and we just need to append this controller name here, participant. So that's the default route in an API controller, which is already mentioned at the top here. API/name of the controller, in this case, participant is the controller name. So API/participant. Now we just need to pass participant here. In order to avoid typo here, I will be creating a constant object here, endpoints. It's an object, and here we will do this participant. I will save the same inside this property, and let's export this constant. Now we just need to do this endpoints participant. Now this will return a collection of objects like this. In order to make a post request, we can call this function post. Into this function, we just need to pass the object that we want to insert. The URL is already generated up above here. So we'll pass the state object values, which contains the field values here. Now we can handle the response inside this then function here. So here we have the callback with the response. For now, let's print this response in developer console. Response. If there is any error, we can handle that inside this callback here. Now let's save this and back to the application. Now let's submit this form for creating a new participant. Now let's submit the form. Here we have an error. So here is the problem. There is a security feature in almost all web API projects called cross-origin resource sharing. Meaning this web API will block requests from another application which is hosted on a different domain or a different port number, like this case. Here we have different port number. So this web API will block requests from the port number 3000 here. So first of all, we have to enable CORS for this port number here. Back to the web API here, and let's stop this execution. Now once again, open this program.cs file. Now let's enable CORS. We can make use of this method, use CORS from this app object here. And here we have the lambda expression with options, options dot with origins. Inside that we have to pass the corresponding origin. So let me copy paste that from this React application here. Make sure to remove the / at the end. And finally, we have to call these two methods, allow any method and allow any header. Now let's run this application without debugging. Now back to the React application. Let's clear these existing errors here. Let's submit this form again. Boom. Here we have the response from the post web API method. And this property data is having the response that we have sent from this post web API method here. Now let's check the participant table. That's it. So here we have the new participant, John Smith. Now in order to check whether it creates a duplicate participant, let's reload this page and let's try to make the same participant again. In order to make it easy, I will enable this option for autocomplete. So let's set this as on here. Save, back to the application, reload. This time it's not working because previously the autocomplete was off. In future, the previously posted data will be shown as an auto suggestion here. Now I will just copy the details from this table here. Submit the form. We got the response with the same data. From this participant ID itself, we could say there is no new participant. The existing participant must be returned. See, that's it. So login is working perfectly fine. Now what else? Now from now onwards, the real game begins. Now we need a state management mechanism to store or preserve and share the data inside the application across various components inside the application. In previous React applications, we were using Redux, but for this application, we'll be using Context API. So let's integrate Context API into this React application here. First of all, let's create rest of the main components inside the application. After login, we'll be showing this component here, question. Now here we have the final component for showing the result of this quiz program. Now let's look how to preserve the state of this application and how to share common data among these components. For that, I will be creating a new hook here. Use state context. First of all, we need a React component. So here it is. And let's name this as context provider. Now let's create a context object. State context. Now we just need to call this function create context. So the nice thing about this context API that everything is already there inside the React library itself. Now let's add the corresponding import statement. So for this component here we have the default parameter props. Now we will be wrapping everything within this context provider where we need the data from the context API. So whatever we have wrapped with this provider can be accessed with the children property here. Now from this component, we are wrapping everything with the context provider like this. State context dot provider, and we'll be showing the children here. Now for this component, we'll be creating a state object like this, context and set context. And let's call this function use state. So inside this context object, we'll be saving the data that we want to share across these components here. Now in order to initialize this context object, I will be creating a separate function, get fresh context. From here, we will return an object with properties that we want to save inside the context with their default values. So first of all, we have participant ID initialized with 0, then time taken to complete the quiz, selected options array. So these are the data that we want to share globally across this application. If you find anything additional, you can add them here. Now let's call this function here. Now we will pass this as a value to this context API here. Context and the corresponding set context function. So the data of this context is saved inside this component state object context, and it is shared across the children of the context provider here. So here we have created and exported this context provider. Actually, we don't want to export it as default. So let me remove this from here. Now let's wrap everything within this context provider. Now let's open the index.root JavaScript file, context provider. Now this app component and its children components can access the data from this context provider here. Let's check how it is done. So first of all, we have to export this context object here. Now let's try to access the values from this context inside this question component here. First of all, we have to call this function useContext. Inside that, we can pass the state context object that we have created. So let's add the corresponding import statement. Now this function will return an object. Now we can restructure the same here. The return object will be similar to the object that we have passed here. It will contain this context and set context. So while destructuring, we can use the same property name. So let me copy this and paste in here. Now this context object contains the values from context API, and this set function can be used to update values inside the context here. So it is exactly similar to handling a React component state object. The only difference is that here we have a context provider, and this provider is used to wrap every component inside the application, and that's how this context is made available across the children components. In order to update the values inside the context API, we can do the same thing that we do with a component state object. We will destructure whatever we have inside the context. Now if you want to update the time taken for this quiz program, you can just update that property here. So this is how context API works. Now we want to make these steps even more simple, because here we have imported the useContext function and the context API object, and everything is destructured here. In order to update the values, we need another destructuring here. So I would like to show you a best practice that you can reuse in your applications. For that, we'll be creating a hook here called useStateContext. And let's export the same by default. Now inside the hook, we will destructure everything inside the context API. So let me copy paste this. Now from this hook, we will be returning the destructured context and the corresponding set function. Now we don't need to import this state context object and this useContext function here. We just need to call the hook that we have just created, useStateContext. Now I want to even simplify this set context function here, just to avoid this destructuring here. For that, I will redefine this set context function here. So here we have the function. For this function, we expect a parameter object, and this object contains the properties inside the context with the updated values. Okay. Now inside the function, we'll be calling the original set context function. Inside that, first of all, we will destructure the context object, and then we will destructure the object parameter. So the redefinition of the set context function is only there inside this return object. Now inside the child component, we don't have to destructure the context object again. We just need to pass an object like this. It will be destructured inside this redefined function here. Hope you will find this more efficient. So this is how we are going to use context API inside the application. Let me remove these statements from here. Now let me remove this set context function invocation here. Now back to the login form. Let me try to log in with the same details that we have provided previously. So after successful login, we have to save this participant ID inside our context API. For that, let's call this useStateContext hook that we have created here. Context and set context. Let's call the hook useStateContext. Now inside this success callback, we just need to update the corresponding participant ID. So we'll call this function setContext. Inside that, we just need to pass an object with the updated participant ID. So the return data from the server can be accessed with this property data. Inside that, we have this property participant ID. Now if you want to check the values inside the context API, let's print the same here, context. Now let's try to log in with the previous participant. Submit the form. Sorry, here we have an error. Set context is not a function. So let's start with the context provider itself. We have created the state object context and its set function, and we have passed the same here. This pair of curly brackets indicate that we have something from JavaScript. Since we have to pass this context object and this set function, we have to pass them inside an object like this. Then only it will work as we expected. Okay, so an object with the context object and its set function is passed to the context provider here. Let me save this and back to the application. Let's try to log in with the previous participant. Let's check the console window. Here we have printed the values from the context API, and it is showing the initial value itself, not the updated participant ID, because this set context function is asynchronous. immediately after invoking this function get executed. Since this function is an asynchronous function, it is running in the background and this function will get executed even before updating the value here. So if you want to see the context value, I will do something else. Inside this render method, we can print the context value, participant ID. Reload the app. Initially, you could see that its value is 0. Now let's try to log in with the same participant. Boom, that's it. The value of the participant ID inside the context is getting updated. Now after this login operation here, we want to show the quiz component where we are planning to show the questions from our DB. For that, first of all, inside this application, I'm going to rename this component as quiz component. Let's update the name here also. Now currently inside the default app component app.js, we are showing the login component. Instead of that, we need a simple routing configuration inside the application. For that, first of all, we have to install this npm package React Router DOM. So here we have successfully installed the package. If you are new to React Router, don't worry, this application is perfect for you to understand how React Router works. Now let's get rid of this login component. First of all, we need to wrap everything with this component, browser router. And we have one more container, routes. Now we can specify the routes for this application. So first of all, we have the default route for the login component. For the default component, path will be a /. With this element property, we can specify the component that we want to show inside this route, which is login. Now let me duplicate this for rest of the two components, quiz and result. So here we will be showing the quiz component and here we have the result component. Sorry, we forgot to import routes and route. Hope you know the shortcut for possible imports. Hold Control then press space. Now let's do the same for this route. Reload the application. So by default, the login component will be navigated with this default route here. Okay. Now after the successful login, we have to navigate inside this route /quiz. In order to navigate into the quiz route, first of all, we have to call the use navigate hook. So we could do this navigate is equal to use navigate. Now inside this successful callback, we just need to call the function navigate with the corresponding route /quiz. Before trying this, let me print this participant ID inside this quiz component here. So we have already destructured the context. Now let's print the context value inside the dev console. Context, that's it. Let's log in with the previous participant. Boom. So here we have successfully logged in inside the application and here we have the quiz component. Now here we have the current value from the context API. Now there is one thing that you must know about context API. The values inside the context API will be lost once you reload the application like this here. See, the participant ID is reset to its initial value. So how can we preserve the context API value across the application? That will be discussed in next video. So in remaining tutorials, we have to fetch random 5 questions from the API and displaying that in our React component here. After completing the 5 questions, we have to show the result of the quiz program along with the correct answers for the question attended by the participant. Once we complete this project, I'll be sharing the GitHub Repository link in video description. For more React or ASP.NET Code tutorial, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. Please like and share this video. See you in second part.